And I think actually fractional leaders will have to up their game and be much, much more professional in that onboarding process. It's no longer going to be enough to turn up, wow them for the first month, and then think you can step back and take a nice fat check every month and just believe that that's something your clients are going to live with indefinitely. So I think the sophistication of clients is going to increase, and the need for fractionals to demonstrate they've got the systems and processes that can mesh with what clients are doing.
And it's also about managing expectations around, right, this is what we're doing, why we're doing it, this is who's going to be involved, and this is the kind of progress you will see at the various stages. So that somebody, if they're inexperienced in a particular area, they're not expecting this amazing result in an unrealistic time frame. Your role is not to be completely operationally immersed in one specific area if you're working in a fractional executive capacity.
And they end up with what I call client capture. If you're working 3 days a week for a client, then the client really notices on the 2 days that you're not there. And they sort of start to experience you as a full-time person, and they expect that full-time responsiveness. And even if you're able to bill them for the 3 days a week, which actually exacerbates the problem in my view, because you then rely on the money, you haven't got the time to go and build up your other clients. You haven't got the time to maintain that portfolio approach.
Welcome to the Fractional Frontier, where we explore the future of leadership in today's evolving business landscape. I'm Lorraine Carty here with Charles McLachlan, and every week we dive deep into the world of high-performing fractional executives and the businesses that leverage them.
Whether you're an experienced fractional leader or a business decision maker seeking top-tier talent, this is the place to be for actionable insights, strategies, and stories from the front lines of fractional leadership.
Today we're focusing on onboarding new clients. Charles, can you briefly tell us how you've developed your views on onboarding new clients as a fractional executive?
Yes, in the past, I've worked with large and small consulting organizations, and they've all had different ways of onboarding new clients. And I would say, just to kick off, the principles of good account management and account development don't change for fractional or portfolio executives. However, the way that you implement them successfully when you're working as a fractional is different. And it requires sensitivity to particular needs and particular aspects of where you engage. So over the last 10 years, working with different professional activities who have become portfolio executives or fractional leaders, I've realized that those who previously have been consultants or interims or contractors or even board advisors risk misunderstanding what a client needs from you over the first 3 or 4 months when you're stepping in as a fractional. And then for some of the people I work with who've only ever had full-time salaried employment, then they've never really experienced that onboarding process except from the client side. And they'll be less aware of the principles involved. So yes, it's been interesting to watch how different people try and go about it and see what best practice looks like.
Yeah, indeed. And without onboarding new clients to demonstrate really tangible value at the beginning of a relationship, there's a high risk that clients have buyer's regret. And once the initial enthusiasm of having committed to working with you starts to fade a little bit, it can compromise things. And I also believe that many clients are actually unfamiliar with how to get the most from the fractional executive they're working with. And you have to really actively engage with your client and the client with you to get most out of that working relationship. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
so for our listeners who may not be familiar with what this potentially entails, Charles, and given your extensive experience, can you explain why onboarding new clients is so important to the fractional executive and their clients?
Yes. So I would say the starting point is that You've really only got one chance to make the very best impression. So you've perhaps been through a process of engaging the client by building a roadmap, um, as how you're going to work together. And now they're expecting you to demonstrate what you can deliver. And I would say that the crucial thing is during the first 3 or 4 months, you need to spend more time than perhaps you would otherwise, but also set up a framework for your ongoing engagement so that the client can see demonstrable value, so that the client can understand the kind of difference you're going to make, and so that you're fully committed with the key relationships, not just with your buyer, who hopefully is the CEO, but the other stakeholders in the executive team that you'll need to work with. And the biggest risk that I've seen is that you could end up only building one relationship with the CEO rather than across the executive team. And you can end up failing to understand the balance between initial high commitment and set expectations. The amount of time you spend with the client will diminish over time.
Yeah, my reflecting on all of that, Charles, it really is about establishing framework and boundaries, but also really front loading fast where possible, value on that return and really developing relationships, because not everything you do is necessarily operational, but a fractional is always about upskilling broader part of the team. So building those relationships with those key people and immediately starting to expand their capabilities and depth of knowledge in your area of what you're doing to help grow the business, and being very upfront with that and communicating that very openly and showing that path of progress very quickly. So the client is involved and very aware, that key decision maker, and is able to see change fast, not only within what you're doing and delivering, but within the team, but also there those clear boundaries around what's appropriate and where you're transferring that capability back into the business.
Yeah, and I remember a finance director that I was working with who was starting out on this fractional journey for the first time. He had persuaded the client that he was engaging with that the real value would be to take the pain of worrying about whether they had enough money in the bank at the end of each month off him, off the CEO, manage the cash flow. Um, and the challenge was that over the first 3 months, he had to focus on making sure the internal systems were set up right, and it makes sure that the contracts were shifted so that people were paying in advance, and then ensuring that all of the credit controls in place so that clients of his client his were paying on time. And for the person who's engaging him, all of that was behind the scenes. They couldn't see that going on. So they'd had him there for 3 months. He produced a quarterly report of the change in the cash flow forecast. But this was the guy who every day, pretty much, he looked at his bank account, see how much money there was in there, because he was used to trying to scrabble around at the end of each month to pay the salaries. So that did not work for the client because the client could not see the progress to the goal. They couldn't realize that things were changing. All that they were experiencing was the fact that it was still about scrabbling around and perhaps putting some of his own money into the business to pay the wage bill.
That's really a case of, and I would see this reflected in my own experience, is if you're putting a system or framework in place, you've got to explain very clearly what and how it's been done and showing how it's done, and getting really clear around what the outcome is ultimately going to be, but the milestones along the way of doing that. And it's not necessarily about you becoming so involved operationally to that level or degree, but where you're potentially upskilling somebody to do that. So you're working with them as opposed to doing it all. Because if you get that involved operationally, you're no longer offering strategic input because you are too involved at the coalface per se.
Yeah, I think so. And I think um, what this FD could have done, um, and I know the business he was working with very well, what he could have done is identified the client who actually was providing them with 80% of their income
Mm,
and really focused on changing the behavior with which that client was paying multiple invoices, um, and made a difference to the cash flow very quickly just by focusing on sorting out that one account
mm,
with the team that was there. And instead, he tried to move across a much broader front,
mm.
and therefore didn't see the tangible difference being delivered to his client because it's as much what the client feels is going on as the reality.
And it's also about managing expectations around, right, this is what we're doing, why we're doing it, this is who's going to be involved, and this is the kind of progress you will see at the various stages. So that somebody, if they're inexperienced in a particular area, they're not expecting this amazing result in an unrealistic time frame. And they're not, your role is not to be completely operationally immersed in one specific area if you're working in a fractional executive capacity. So, what other issues have you seen, Charles, with fractional executives who are grappling with onboarding new clients properly?
Yeah, well, let me give you another sort of cautionary tale, I suppose. And this happens quite often early in somebody's portfolio executive work style. They get their first client. They are delighted that there's some money coming in,
Mm,
and they start to over deliver in a way that actually, rather than spending perhaps 1 day a week, which is a rational thing to do at the beginning of a relationship,
mm,
they start to spend 2 or 3 days a week.
mm,
And they end up with what I call client capture.
mm,
If you're working 3 days a week for a client, then the client really notices on the 2 days that you're not there.
mm,
And they sort of start to experience you as a full-time person, and they expect that full-time responsiveness.
mm,
And even if you're able to bill them for the 3 days a week, which actually exacerbates the problem in my view, because you then rely on the money,
mm.
um, you haven't got the time to go and build up your other clients. You haven't got the time to maintain that portfolio approach.
Yeah.
And there's one particular guy I worked with who I have a huge amount of respect for, very experienced consultant, but he ended up so committed to a single client that he was working 3 days a week. Then the client said, well, if you're working 3 days a week, we should move you onto a salaried basis,
Mm,
starting to engage with own clients and delivering to their own clients. So become part of the delivery process for that client.
mm.
And then in order to do the value added stuff, he moved to 4 days a week. So now he's pretty much back in a full-time permanent salary position.
Oh,
And
definitely. Yeah.
um, the 4 days a week probably involves full-time number of hours. So just lost himself in it. And, I appreciate that the client really valued him. I appreciate he was really passionate about what the client was doing, but his opportunity to build a portfolio, he'd just blown it.
Well, you can't because you've literally got no time left. He's really nearly short of 1 day in a full time role. And that comes back to the question of what do you want? And how are you setting yourself up for success and setting the client up for success and then managing all the structures around that and the people involved and the expectations? It's about that critical knowledge transfer piece of working as a successful fractional executive. So you are enabling that team.
Completely. And I think the other example I have is a person who came in and it was the other problem. So they had agreed with the client that they were going to provide really something around 1 or 2 days a month.
Mm,
Um, and they were coming in supporting a finance director by being the CFO focused on fundraising.
mm,
And in order to get traction, this person relied upon activities done by other members of the team. The organization was smaller, perhaps, than he recognized, and engaging those other members of the team who were flat out doing their day jobs was really problematic.
mm,
So 4 weeks in, I was reviewing with him what was going on, and he really wasn't able to show much tangible progress. Um,
Mm.
and the big risk for him is the client was going to pay his bills. In fact, the finance director was going to pay his bills and sit there and think, okay, but what's actually changed? And the big difficulty for him then was, how do I show that I've been on it, but actually the finance director and the founder have not been making the contributions I need from them for me to be able to deliver? And how can he do that without embarrassing those fellow executives in the team, but
Mm.
also protect himself from being perceived to have done nothing?
I mean, I think probably one of the biggest takeaways, and certainly in my own reflections on this, is hugely around managing people, managing expectations, establishing boundaries, and being disciplined yourself as much as calling everybody to account. And you can still do that, very sensitively. Uh, because if we're leaders, we have to be accountable, and those working with us have to be accountable. So, if we're looking at if you have got things set up well and you've onboarded and you've got those frameworks, boundaries, and expectations, and you are delivering and have identified where you can deliver high value quickly, um, and show measurable results. Once you've got all of that established, uh, how do you ensure that you can successfully transition from that onboarding phase to that business as usual, where you're continuing to help the business grow and develop? How do you then transition into that phase of things where you're still working on an ongoing basis, but that really front loaded area has now got into a more manageable, smoother working scenario?
Yeah, I think in some ways that tension reemerges at this point because your client has got used to a certain pace of
Mm,
delivery from you, but actually they've got limited discretionary capacity within their teams to support ongoing transformation. So you might get a burst of enthusiasm for other team members, other executives at the beginning, but
mm,
then in smaller organizations, business as usual and their own strategic priorities start to take over. So
mm,
there are a number of tactics that I recommend people do to support this.
mm,
One is early on in the relationship, identify additional team members that need to come into your team so that you're not doing so much work. Um,
mm,
I've seen people coming into the finance function again where they are coming in as finance director. The client's really only got a bookkeeper, and the risk is that the bookkeeper can't step up to do the management accounts or the credit control, and the finance director should not be stepping down to do those things.
mm,
So he needs, or she, the finance director, needs to bring in some other people who can support those ancillary roles. And then that enables you to have more time to do the strategic stuff. But the second thing, and perhaps the classic story around this, is somebody who's coming in as a chief revenue officer. So they're
mm,
responsible for the sales function and the marketing function and how that links through to the product function.
mm,
And they might be demonstrating quick wins by upping the game of the sales team, and showing a lot of traction initially, but they probably don't own the product function.
mm,
And it may well be that the marketing function has been the sort of pet of the founder because that's how he expresses himself to the market.
mm,
So renegotiating those boundaries and ensuring that the leaders in those two spaces will up their game and deliver because effectively they're suppliers into the revenue function
mm.
actually requires a lot of work at the beginning. And often that again, those teams are under resourced.
Yeah.
Also, they're not doing the right things and they're not doing them right. So setting that pathway so those other teams that either are supplying services to you or consuming the services you provide from your department are properly aligned and committed to doing their side of the bargain really matters. Because it's no point having a brilliant sales team if the marketing people just aren't generating qualified leads. It's no point going out and trying to sell a product which is out of date and is ropey. There's no point trying to sell when your reputation is being destroyed by the lack of good customer service once clients have bought. So there's a whole set of things that you have to engage with. And I think that's the other piece of the equation that people can miss.
Well, it's a huge amount of the unexpected people management factor. I don't think there's any business where I've worked where there isn't an unintentional or perhaps even intentional saboteur element to the equation, because fundamentally most people don't really like change. And unless you are the decision maker at the top of the table who's got to keep a really close eye on where the money sits in the business, often people will just not put their extra muscle behind what's needed to implement change. So it's very much around also sharing the rationale behind that and being really clear about what's in it for them,
Well, that's the
or
key.
for
Is
them to buy
what's in
into.
it to them? How can you make the other executives in the executive team look better, um, so that you can succeed?
Yeah,
And how can you give the CEO what he really, really wants
yeah.
rather than the stuff that he says he wants, which may be different. The CEO who is exhausted by worrying about whether he can pay the salary each month, he probably cares more about that than his balance sheet.
Mm,
Probably cares more about that than how much money he's going to take home for him. He
mm,
probably cares more about that than how fast the business grows. But when you come in, he might have sold you a big vision of, I'm going to grow the top line by
mm,
50% over the next 12 months.
mm.
That's
Uh,
not the thing that's keeping him up at night.
it's about getting out of that high adrenaline survival mode back into confidence of knowing that there are certain things that can be done to implement change, and then really aligning people around that. And sometimes there's tough choices in terms of some people just don't want to move with where the change needs to move to, but that's a whole different topic for another day. I guess the big takeaway here, Charles, when I reflect on my own experience and everything you're sharing is it's not just when you're working in as a fractional executive, it's not just about your professional area or range of expertise in its purest sense, whether you're CTO, whether you're finance or whether you're a brand expert. It's also a huge amount of people management and recognizing, because that's often the most difficult part of the equation, particularly in an under-resourced SME business.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I think the other thing, though, is as a portfolio executive who's coming at this from 20 or 30 years of experience in corporate life, by then you should understand what the other functions in the business do. You
Mm,
should understand the things that will bother them. You should be able to identify what's in it for them,
mm,
if they make you more successful. And I think the real challenge is if you fail to understand the emotional gains that those people need, um,
mm.
which are often so different from the tangible metrics that they're seeking to achieve. And in a smaller organization, those dynamics are much more like a family business.
Yeah,
It's more about the relationships.
yeah.
You'll find a founder has got with him two or three people around him that he implicitly trusts.
Mm,
He's more interested in trusting them than whether they're doing a good job. He just knows that they've got his back. Um,
yeah.
and if you come in and you undermine those trusted people,
Mm.
you're creating life that's going to be very difficult for you going forward.
Well, you're really sabotaging your own scenario and whether you can actually continue to work on with the business in a long-term scenario. Uh, so actually reading and understanding those different alignments and dynamics in a small business is critical. And the dynamics in a small business are difficult to any other. And the fact is, an awful lot of small businesses do have a family element to them. And that brings to it a whole different layer that you just don't see in big enterprise organizations.
Yeah, well, I've got a sort of cautionary tale about a situation where I came in to do some consulting for a client and helping them to plan for sale. And they said, "Look, Charles, we love what you're doing. Come and be our CEO. We want to step away, so come and be our CEO." So, small business, really exciting area that I'd not had any experience with at that particular time. And my background is IT. This was all about executive coaching, leadership development. Love the idea of getting involved in something as new as that. Um, and it was very new, 25 years ago when I entered into this arrangement.
Hmm.
So what happened? Well, when I got there, I knew that two of the founders were husband and wife. So that was quite straightforward.
Yeah.
Um, and then there was two other sort of almost like partners in this firm. So there are four key partners. What I hadn't realized was that one of those, who was about 15, 20 years younger than the founders, was almost being treated like their adopted son. So they sort of rescued him and they were looking after him, and he was like their adopted son.
Yeah.
And then the person who was doing all the bookkeeping and was the administrator actually had been the woman who'd looked after the founder's children as a sort of home help, nanny. And then the person doing the marketing was the girlfriend of one of their sons. Their son was in the business developing the website. Their other son was using the business as his office. And I completely messed up because I thought that they'd make decisions based upon commercial realities and sensible things to do. Oh no. This guy who was their sort of adopted son, when I started to point out his failings, the difficulty he was presenting, the fact that he was using some of the money for expenses that probably weren't justified in any shape or form as a business expense.
Mhm.
And he'd got this little hobby business that he was doing on the side that was basically allowing him to do what he liked with the
Mm.
company's money.
Ooh.
When I pointed out that their bankers that they'd had for 30 years were siphoning money out of their personal accounts to underpin their business overdraft without letting them know, you would have thought, they'd love to know all this stuff. Oh no, they didn't really want to know all this stuff, because it was more important to them to continue to have these trusted relationships, or these familial relationships. I can't really call them family, familial relationships, than
Yeah.
actually to do the right thing for the business. And so I had that in the UK, we call the black bin liner moment. Came in from a bank holiday Monday, came in on a Tuesday, and I was greeted with a black bin liner, told to take any of my personal belongings away and hand over my keys and leave the premises immediately, which, yeah, that was a wake up call in account management and client development.
I actually have a similar story whereby, yeah, but another, like where, yes, guy come into the business was being treated like the adopted son, but the challenge was there was an actual son in the business, or, and it wasn't necessarily working well because the adopted son was being seen as the potential next person in line who would run the operation as opposed to the actual. So all the tensions around that. So there were so many blind spots and it presented so many challenges. And you actually get to a point where you have to ask yourself a tough question of, can I actually make a meaningful difference here? Because the emotional drivers of the combination of people here, if there's not a willingness to change or a willingness to recognize the vulnerabilities from these dynamics, it actually becomes very difficult for you to actually do what you came to do within that business.
Yeah, so true. And some of the people I work with, they love turnaround situations. They love going into something which is broken and sorting it out.
Yeah.
Um, and if they've done that, in their previous lives for large organizations, then there's a lot of room to know, um, break eggs while making omelets.
Mm,
In smaller businesses, in
you can't
small
do that.
organizations, maybe that doesn't work. And even though the organization may be under existential threat,
Mm.
there are situations in which people would be prefer to have it fail than to have these relationships broken. And ultimately, that's what happened with the business that I left. You know, they in 2 years later, they had to do a pre-pack, get rid of all of their debts, get rid of their, uh, very expensive property lease, and essentially hand the business over to the adopted son and sit back in the background. So, yeah, it's
It
interesting.
comes back to that thing which talk so often about in brand strategy is never underestimate the irrational human emotional drivers. And that comes for everything in the business, not only just in building the brand, but the people within it and also your target audience. Those are the the unexpected missiles that can sabotage everything.
So we've talked a lot about the problems, Lorraine. I hope it doesn't
Yeah.
put people off.
Well, it's like you don't really want to come to this without having some awareness, and being better informed means you're better armed and you can anticipate some of those challenges or at least recognize them before you get yourself into a really difficult, sticky situation. So I've a question that's here from one of our listeners, and the question is: if I'm engaging a fractional leader, how can I ensure that the onboarding process is actually successful?
Nice switch. So this is the client trying to help the fractional leader succeed. Yeah, so I think the more that you can be explicit about what really matters to you as the CEO or the COO or whatever position you've got, the better. The more that you can prime the other executives that the fractional leader is going to be engaging with, that they need to play their part.
Mm,
And the more that you can set up some kind of uh, very simple progress reporting structure so that you can see that the fractional leader is making a difference, but also you can explain to the rest of your executive team and whoever's funding this that they're making a difference. So I think it's all about how you set things up.
mm,
Now, you may need to spend quite a lot of the time at the beginning of the relationship helping that fractional lead to understand, like, who's who in the zoo. You know,
mm,
help them to navigate around the team, understand the strengths and weaknesses and personal foibles of people. If you've ever done any work with personality profiling, you know, you will know that people in your team react differently to the same stimulus, and you need to help the fractional leader to fast track those relationships and understand what really happens. And it's
mm.
just little things like don't ever contact the head of marketing on a Thursday afternoon because he will be leaving early in order to see his um, child who's in therapy or whatever it is. You know,
Yeah,
some
yeah, yeah.
those kinds of things actually really matter. Um, and it's so easy for a fractional leader to come in and not understand the dynamics of something that's been going on for a long time before they turned up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There are so many things that need to be considered, and it all comes back to people management and managing the boundaries around that and trying to anticipate things, which of course you get better at with experience, even if you've got a few scars to go with it as well.
Well, yeah, talking about scars, we've had a listener ask, what do you do to recover if your onboarding hasn't really worked as a fractional leader? You've got lots of problems. What what would you say to somebody who, okay, this is their first time, it hasn't worked out quite the way they wanted it to. How can they pull back?
I think you have to be as transparent as possible and honest with your client, and you've got to acknowledge there is a challenge. Something here isn't working as well as we would like. So let's come back and reevaluate what stage we're at, what we agreed, and what our real objectives are here, and where we got in the context of that, and what isn't quite working like we should do. So we can agree how we can move that forward. But it's about acknowledging that something isn't as good as you'd like it to be and the reasons why. And then getting agreement, then can we just reevaluate of how we're going to enhance this and what additional or new structures we're going to put in place, or who else is going to be involved, so we can achieve the outcomes that are needed for the business.
Yeah, and I think in that kind of context, you have to balance your desire to come in and be the expert
Mm,
and tell them what's what
mm,
with actually the need to admit you've got some things wrong.
yeah.
And it's very tempting as an outsider. I saw this when I was a consultant at a big firm. It's very tempting as an outsider to point to everybody else
Mhm,
and to say, I couldn't do it because of them, or I couldn't do it
mhm,
because of this. But actually, if you're coming as a fractional, it's your responsibility to make things work. You've come into a situation which may not have been of your making, but you're there to make a difference. And so to say to the CEO or say to your fellow executives, I'm really sorry, I should have realized this, or I can see that we should be further along with this, but I didn't know that I had to do this other thing first,
mm,
or I hadn't properly evaluated the strength of the team that I was taking over,
mm,
or something's changed in the market, which I should have known was going to change. All of those things take responsibility, um, and that will build more trust. There's lots of classic stories about in the consumer space. If you as a consumer go into a restaurant and they mess something up, and the chef comes out of the kitchen, grovels and apologizes and give you a free bottle of champagne and really looks after you, actually, you may feel better about that restaurant than if they'd never made a mistake. And I
yeah.
think there is something about taking responsibility, acknowledging that you're not an expert on everything, and being able to get help from the team.
Fundamentally, you are as much accountable as the team is, and you have to own that.
I mean, I used to be a consultant, so I can claim this. Uh, Shame, none of that slopey shoulders.
Mm,
We would have succeeded if you'd done your bit stuff. You're now part of the team.
yeah, exactly. So, how do you see the onboarding of clients evolving then, Charles?
Well, I think there is going to be more and more fractional engagement. And I think what's going to change over time is that clients will get more sophisticated in using fractionals.
Mm,
And they will start to recognize that actually there are systems and processes that they can adopt, which will get more value out of them. I think with the use of brokers, then the brokers will also take more responsibility for ensuring client success.
mm,
And I think actually fractional leaders will have to up their game and be much, much more professional in that onboarding process. It's no longer going to be enough to turn up, wow them for the first month,
mm,
and then think you can step back and take a nice fat check every month,
yeah.
and just believe that that's something your clients are going to live with indefinitely. So I think the sophistication of clients is going to increase, and the need for fractionals to demonstrate they've got the systems and processes that can mesh with what clients are doing.
And that's before we even add in, which will be a topic for another day. That's before we even layer on the complexities of the way tech is changing and enhancing, the way some of that tech is potentially leaving people vulnerable or feeling vulnerable, or the way, particularly with smaller businesses, they might be struggling at a leadership level because they're maybe not digital natives to embrace how AI and some of that can actually enable the business far more effectively. Because I am listening to occasionally worries and concerns as opposed to saying, yes, there are huge benefits, and just being more aware of how that can be actually a huge game changer for a more leanly resource business when it's used effectively.
Yes. And I suppose the other thing we need to keep remembering is that as a fractional leader, you are your brand. So what advice would you give about how onboarding well can enhance your end-to-end brand proposition?
It needs to be part of your personal brand. It needs to be part of your business brand where you intentionally develop a structured framework around how you are going to kick off that relationship, along with whatever systems and processes you also bring to the table as part of how you actually bring your expertise and apply it. And manage that from the beginning, explain why, having identified where there are vulnerabilities or challenges, or where you are going to come in to help be that catalyst for change and support that change process or enhancement process. But it's about really, I come back to an enablement, knowledge transfer, being really clear, having a system in place, a framework. Yes, you have to have flexibilities, but you're educating the client and part of that, and being really clear about why you're doing it and the expectations for each step of the way, and who potentially could or should be involved. Gives you enough flexibility, but it gives clients something more tangible to reference off.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think then take that back into how you talk about your client process to potential new clients.
Mhm.
Take it back to the credentials that people put up for you. Take it back to the stories you tell when you meet clients for the first time, so that actually that reassurance of what's going to happen in the first 90 days and how that's going to set them up for a beautiful long-term relationship
Mm,
is established
mm.
through that storytelling and real live examples of how you've got it right, or how you used to get it wrong, but now you are getting it right.
Yeah, it's all about effective communication. And for some people with with certain kind of skill sets, that kind of level of communication might seem like a nuisance to them, but it's actually critically important for success. So thank you very much for sharing all those insights, wisdom, and a few scars, Charles, all about onboarding new clients. Can you share with our listeners where they can find you and learn more about how you support fractional executives to be really successful?
Yes, probably the simplest way to find me is to look for portfolioexecutive.biz, and there's a contact form there. And if you use the contact form, having watched this podcast, and ask for the secret link to the AI tool that we've developed to give fractional executives advice, then just mention that in the contact form and I'll give you the secret link. And you can talk to this AI tool, which has ingested all of the experience we've built up over the last 10 years. And we'll give you all sorts of tips and tricks as an established fractional executive.
It sounds hugely intriguing, Charles. So,
Lorraine, any final thoughts or takeaways before we
no,
close?
I think we've given people enough to think about at the moment without going into other areas. I think it's all about having systems, frameworks as at least as a starting base point, managing expectations, and really understanding and managing the dynamics of the people factor, and just expecting that there are going to be people factor elements that are going to throw you curved balls.
So that's it for today's episode of the Fractional Frontier. We hope you found the conversation insightful.
Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn for more exclusive content and catch the edited episode on all major platforms. And don't forget to subscribe. And if you enjoyed today's discussion, leave us a review or share the episode with your network. Thanks for exploring the fractional frontier with us, where leadership knows no boundaries.